Hi, I'm Lorna from Thread and Yarn. Welcome back to my channel all about sewing and knitting and natural dyeing, making goodness. So today I thought I'd show you a bit about French seams and some tips that I find useful for using French seams on all of your garments. French seams are just a really lovely way of finishing off garments neatly. They make it feel really luxurious. That seam is completely hidden, so it just feels really nice. I think it suits some fabrics really well, in particular silk, for example. If you've got a nice silk shirt, like I'm making this green one at the moment, you might have seen in my shorts. I've got a video coming up on the making of this. It's still in progress at the moment, as you can see. But it just makes it feel that extra bit special to have the French seam on the inside. And if you happen to watch the sewing bee that's just started, the last episode talked a bit about French seams. It was one of the challenges. Some people found it a bit tricky to keep it looking neat. And so I thought it was a timely video to show you a bit about French seams. Yeah, I hope it's useful. For those of you who haven't seen a French seam before, I'll talk you through it quickly what it is. So basically, a French seam is a way of finishing the inside of your garment without any raw edge being able to be seen. So you actually sew your seam twice. So this is a dress I made for a wedding last summer. It's this nice viscose drapey fabric, and I really wanted to make sure that the seams felt neat and that there were, as neatly as you finish your seams with zigzag or overlocking, it's still got a slight roughness to it, and I didn't want any of that to be able to be seen through this quite sort of drapey garment. As you can see, it's got quite a drape. So I used French seams. So from the outside, it looks pretty much the same as a normal seam, but from the inside, it looks like this. You can see that there's no raw edge, it's completely encased. And the raw edge seam is hidden within this sort of pocketed seam here. It just gives it a really nice finish. I like to do this with a lot of my sort of dressier garment makes, with like wedding guest dresses or that silk shirt that I'm making. I think it just has a really nice finish. So I'll show you how to do that. I hope seeing it brings it to life a little bit. I've chosen some fabric because it's quite to demonstrate with. It's quite important when you're sewing French seams to understand what the wrong side and the right side of your fabric is. Now, with that purple dress I just showed you, and with this green shirt that I'm making, you can't tell what the right side and the wrong side of the fabric is. It's up to you. You choose what is the right side and the wrong side. But you do have to keep track of which is which. So sometimes I'll mark it with a chalk or an erasable or dissolvable pen. But for the purposes of this demonstration, to keep it really obvious, I've chosen a fabric that has quite an obvious right and wrong side. So this is the right side of the fabric that you can see, and this is the wrong side. Now, normally when you sew a seam, you put right side, so the outer fabric that is going to be facing out for the world to see, you put it facing inwards. But this is not how we do it with a French seam. With a French seam, we will start off with right sides outwards, so both wrong sides facing each other. The other thing to bear in mind is your pattern might tell you to sew a French seam, and it will walk you through step by step. I've definitely sewn some like that. However, there are going to be other patterns that you might want to hack and do a French seam, and it's important that your French seam allowances add up to the total seam allowance of the garment that you're making. So for example, say I'm making a garment and the seam is a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. The two seams that I'm going to sew for my French seam need to add up to 5/8 of an inch. One seam needs to be 3/8 of an inch and the other needs to be 2/8 or a quarter. It's quite typical to sew the 3/8 of an inch seam first, especially on the curve, but I'll talk more about that in a bit. So first off, what we're going to do is put our fabric wrong sides facing for seam number 1, and we are going to pin it and sew a 3/8 seam allowance. So 3/8 of an inch is roughly the same as a centimetre. Your machine should have either on the foot plate, mine's got it on this bobbin case here, a little marker to help you find where your seam allowance is. If it doesn't, you can measure it out and sort of draw it along with some erasable chalk, but hopefully you've got some sort of indicator here. So I'm going to sew 3/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way down this little piece. So yep, you can see my seam. Good to check your tension as well, make sure it's all nice and neat. Next step is I'm going to trim this seam as close as I can to the seam line. Now, you have to be really careful not to clip into the actual stitching. So you want to get close, but not dangerously close. It's important to trim enough that our next step is to fold it as you would a normal seam with the right sides together. And what we're going to do next is sew another seam line down here, encasing that raw edge and making it so we've got a nice smooth seam for our right side. So you need to have trimmed enough off that you don't have little fabric hairs, little fray bits that poke through from the raw seam, because this is what it'll be like. You don't want to see any of this. You want that to be completely hidden by your new seam, so you need to trim enough off that when you do your next seam, which should be 1/4 inch if you're trying to add up to 5/8, because remember we sewed a 3/8 seam allowance the first time, so it needs to be completely encased by that new seam. So I'm actually going to trim a tiny bit more off to be on the safe side. Now this is where people got a little unstuck in the sewing bee episode the other day. There wasn't enough trimmed off, so some little fray hairs poked through, which is really easily done, especially with a sort of fabric that frays a lot. Okay, so the next step is to press that seam flat with the right sides together, because that's going to allow us to sew a really neat line down here. So now I've got it in position, I've pressed it, I'm going to sew down a 1/4 inch seam encasing this first one, following my guide on my foot plate. That's my second seam. Quite difficult while holding the camera with one hand. Big reveal. Good. Now we see there's no hairs poking through. Good. No frayed edges. Nice, smooth. So this is the outside of your garment. And it looks pretty neat. If we look at the inside, we've got our French seam. So it's really lovely. It's pretty speedy as a seam because you don't have to spend all that time overlocking or zigzagging your edge, and it just gives it such a nice professional finish. I really, really like doing it. So it's pretty easy as long as you follow those basic steps. So that's how to sew a basic French seam. Just a couple of tips for how to sew around a curve is pretty much the same. Just a couple of extra things to bear in mind. The main thing that's you should do to help sort of ease your French seam around the curve is to make sure that you're sewing your biggest seam the first time, so 3/8 of an inch the first time, trimming it really short as close as you can to the seam line, and then sewing your 1/4 inch seam second. You do not want anything sort of wider than a 1/4 inch for your second seam, otherwise you'll struggle to sort of ease it around and you'll end up with some fabric puckering when you turn it the right side out. So those are the most important things. Keeping your second seam really narrow, trimming it so it's quite short, and pressing it neatly. I hope you find it helpful. It's just a very brief overview of French seams, but just a couple of things to bear in mind. So making sure that you know which side are your right and wrong side, and you keep track of it the whole time. So even if your fabric doesn't have an obvious right and wrong side, marking it, because it's so easy to do a perfect French seam down one side of the shirt and on the other side just go into autopilot and start sewing right sides together again and having to unpick a whole seam, which is a real pain, especially if it's on nice sort of delicate fabric like silk. So keeping track of which is your right and wrong side, and then also making sure that you sew your bigger seam first, then trimming close to that seam allowance, then making sure that if you're sewing around a curve, you're trimming even closer and you're doing that big seam the first time around. And then when you sew your second seam, keeping it that narrow seam allowance. It looks nicer on the inside not to have a big sort of flappy French seam, but to have a really nice narrow one, especially important in curves. And make sure you really press those seams in between as well, because it gives it that really nice crisp finish and it's so much easier to sew on. But I'm really getting into making sure that the insides of my garments look just as nice as the outsides and are robust and last well and feel lovely. Like, I don't want to be putting loads of work into something that I think looks really nice on the outside and it doesn't feel that good inside, and I know I've hidden a load of bodges and stuff like that. So yeah, give French seams a go. So I hope that was helpful. It's just a whistle-stop tour on French seams and a little bit tiny tip about how to sew them around a curve. And I hope that that makes you a bit more confident with using French seams and different things, and you can make nice drapey dresses and silk shirts or whatever you want. I mean, put French seams in anything. Feel fancy all the time. Why not? Yeah, if you've got any other tips that I haven't mentioned, I'd love it if you popped them in the comments. You know, we're always learning and I'm always happy for new tips as well. If you like this video, I'd love it if you liked it and subscribed to my channel for more sewing, knitting, crafty tips and intros into my self-made wardrobe. Next time, actually, while I got you, is probably going to be the making of this silk shirt. I think it's such a nice colour and I'm really excited, and I hope you join me for a little bit of a sew along. It's not going to be a tutorial, it's more of I'm doing a pattern mashup and I'm just showing you my process as we go. So yeah, join me for that one. I hope I'll post that one probably early next week. See you soon.